This case involved a brave young person, a student, who came forward and made a report to police that then led to the Greene County Sheriff's Office and Children's Division investigation.
This is the mugshot of Dr. Lewis Krenn Jr., who practices family medicine along with several other doctors at this Cox Health Clinic located in Chesterfield Village. But yesterday, Greene County Prosecutor Dan Patterson filed criminal charges against Krenn under a Missouri law dealing with sexual contact with a student, which applies to a certain group of people.
Before we had this relatively new statute, the legislature looked, though, at teachers, volunteers, or coaches. And if you take advantage of that position of trust, then the crime is elevated to sexual contact with a student and becomes a felony.
In this case, Krenn fell into Category 4, a volunteer from an organization working with a student or program. He's facing 2 charges, with a more serious felony charge punishable by up to 4 years in prison and/or a $10,000 fine. He's accused of inappropriately touching the 17-year-old girl and offering $50 in exchange for photos of her in a bikini. Investigators say the teen also said Krenn made comments to her and did things that she did not think were appropriate.
There was a period of what we would associate or call grooming, designed to make a victim more comfortable with situations that are inappropriate, leading to a sexual touching like is charged in this case.
Cox Health released a statement saying, "We are aware that a Cox Health physician was detained by law enforcement on Tuesday for a matter unrelated to work. Cox Health takes these situations very seriously. It is our practice to place employees on leave when we are notified of investigations by law enforcement. As an organization, we prioritize safety and respect in all that we do," unquote. Officials there also told us their team is contacting Krenn's patients who have appointments to determine the best next steps. While innocent until proven guilty, Krenn has been ordered to self-report to the Missouri Board of Healing Arts, which has the authority to pull his license.
I know the Board of Healing Arts takes these kinds of situations very seriously, and I would anticipate that would be a natural outcome should there be a conviction.
Reporting for KY3, I'm Joe Hickman.
Well, Krenn pleaded not guilty this morning and is scheduled to appear in court again on April 30th.